when I hear you guys, I see your challenges, and I think the biggest thing from us is to be able to deliver so you can get your chores, no? I think in that sense, Microsoft it's really working on supercomputing power. So we need power to deliver for everybody to be able to do this kind of computations. We recently created the first AI supercomputer using FPGAs, which are hardware that is programmable on demand, so you can change it after you build it. It's kind of interesting technique. It allows us to do supercomputing type of tasks. For example, we can translate Wikipedia in less than a tenth of a second. This is 6 billion words it's faster than blinking. So I think this allows us to deliver on things that, like you were saying, being able to do this kind of cross-correlations across different data and then gather insight. If you don't have the power to compute this, that's impossible. And I think another aspect that is important from Microsoft's perspective, we're not just doing this for the fun of it, we're delivering it for the consumer to use. We have already applied it to Bing search. It's reducing the Bing search to 28 milliseconds of loading instead of waiting for seconds of blank pages. And I think everybody here is going to be able to use it in Power BI very soon. Our cognitive services run on these supercomputers. Mm-hmm. So if you want to do computer vision or natural language processing, you're going to be able to do this using our cloud. Yeah,
the scale is something that, I've been at Microsoft actually to be 10 years tomorrow. So I've seen a pretty large progression. You think about the Wikipedia example of the ability for journalists, for editors, to reporters to parse this immense amount of data. I read when we were working on the Wikipedia project that if you took all of Wikipedia and somehow managed to print it out on 8 by 11 pieces of paper and stacked it, it would be a quarter of a mile high. Like, you think about the sheer volume of text, 6 billion words, and the ability to effectively run through all of it, translate it with a very, very high accuracy rate in less than a tenth of a second is incredibly important stuff. So I want to take that level of technologic baseline, and let's go back to what's happening, not necessarily now, but where we see things are starting to go. The idea of personalization is something that really is compelling, I think, to everybody in this room. The idea of news that is both a collective experience, so that everybody can read effectively from the same hymnal, but gives me that personalized touch and the personalized angle, so it's very, very relevant to me. I think about, when you think about the power of AI for that storytelling, I think about the research project that was recently done, or an AI-generated podcast, where using AI and loading in an immense level of data, you can customize the podcast and the characters based on your own personalized experience. So I'd love to kick it over to both Lisa and Reg to talk a little bit about where you see, expand a little bit on where you see that personalization heading.
Well, first of all, I want to say this, it's a bit of a different point, but I want to say it before I forget it, and we can come back to it. I mean, when I hear Mar talk about the technological capabilities, and we read about these things all the time, and we learn about them at conferences like this one, it strikes me that I think one of the things that, we're Reuters and AP, two very large agencies. There's still a tremendous challenge in getting these technologies into the hands of smaller newsrooms. And we've still got a long way to go to really have the entire news industry able to capitalize on these great technological advancements that we're seeing. And it really strikes me how 4 years after we started creating earnings stories and sports stories from data, which is kind of like the 101 of automation, I still am getting, there's still tremendous interest in just that. We've got a long way to go before, we really are even able to take advantage of all this. Anyway, we can come back to that.
Well, it's a great point. While we're there, let's stay on it for a second. So we're lucky enough to have you both on stage with AP and Reuters, two of the largest media organizations in the world. You have immense resources, lots of money, lots of reporters.
Immense resources.
Immense resources. You heard it here first. I didn't expect that to be the joke of the day. I had some lines prepared, but compared to a lot of media organizations out there, you have immense resources. I guess everything is relative. Depends on where you're standing.
He does. I don't.
Right. It's funny because when you talk to us, it's like, oh, I really wish I had more resources. We're Microsoft. So I think we're all in that same boat. But how do we help, for everybody in this room, not everybody is working in an organization of your size or our size. So how do we think about democratizing AI, and where do people start? I think it's a really great point because it can be so overwhelming. Even if you jump onto Azure.com and you say, I want to get started with Azure and I'm going to get started with cognitive services, there's a lot going on there. So where do you think that people need to start to help, to dip their toe in the water, and what do we need to do to democratize those technologies to make sure that it's available?
A lot of, the technology is getting democratized, right? I mean, there's things, you think about things like graphics. A few years ago, you'd have to you'd need to know a lot more coding to be able to do work well. These days, there's all sorts of tools out there that you can use. And the things that Ma are talking about, I'm assuming that at some point, just reach out to more people. You can do more and more things without understanding code. I heard the demonstration of Steve the bot. Unfortunately, he's not running now. But I mean, the speed at which you could build it was, I thought, pretty amazing. So I think that those are the sorts of tools that will go out to newsrooms, and you won't need to be a real expert. You don't need to have to do all this coding. I think the tools will come to people one way or the other. Somebody will build them because there's a need that needs to be filled, and there's probably a good business in that as well.
I think that's right, and I think also, you're seeing examples of that happening. When John Keefe was up here from Quartz yesterday talking about building bots and making those available on Document Cloud, things like that will happen. We've talked a lot about creating news industry groups and shared forums for being able to share best practices, discuss vendors, things like that. I think those things will come along to help us all develop our muscles around this technology. But it's an important point because, and I guess this is the evolution of all technologies. It starts out being used by the few or the large organizations and then works its way down. But I still think that there's a lot of very basic training and knowledge that needs to get down to the smaller level.
Absolutely. And Mar, from a technical perspective, from a Microsoft perspective, I'm curious what your group and what Microsoft Research is doing to help partner with organizations like the AP and Reuters and elsewhere to really help push the idea of what's possible with AI.
I think for us, the biggest change is going to be, for all the news organization, it's going to be when we're able to identify who is reading or who is consuming our content. The content creator has the power of the content, not the aggregator, nor a third party who is doing a personality test on the content. And I think the biggest leap forward that we're going to see is when we're able to identify who is reading, who is consuming. And that's going to happen for all of us here, not just for the big organization, also for a small one. And with that in hand, we're going to be able to target advertising better, and you're going to be able to produce content that is meaningful for this consumer. Out of so much data, you're going to be able to identify who is consuming your content. And I think that's going to be the big leap forward that's going to democratize all this AI. So you can get ahead on your advertising, on your content, and also it's going to be a big push on the editorials.
So I think you bring up a really interesting piece, particularly around the idea of personalization based on who's reading and the immense amount of data that is produced off of each individual, which leads to a really important issue that I think is top of mind for all of us, which is trust. We had GDPR Day last week. Everybody survived, I hope. I see some people laughing and some people scowling, so we're all working through that together. But I think there's something really compelling, really interesting to think about the role of AI as a potential pitfall for trust when it comes to news organizations.
Well, so I think we're at an early stage where, just as the early age of, say, photography years ago, a century ago, where we really need to sort of evolve standards and systems for explaining to readers what we're doing, what the methodology is. We need to be much more clear about what the biases are in the data that we're analyzing, the biases in the algorithms that we're using to analyze that data, and things that we can create so that people have a good sense of comfort that what they're getting, even as a personalized story or simply as a machine-assisted story in a cybernetic newsroom, is the sort of thing that they can trust. But I'll also worry about the flip side of that, because obviously this can be weaponized to spread misinformation as well, because clearly it's a technology that anybody can use. And so I think we really have to think very clearly about what the future holds and how the public is brought along in a way that that understands how all this is affecting the news that they're getting.
Yeah, I was going to say that in addition to personalization, the whole area of verification and trust is really the other massive bucket of opportunity and challenge here. I mean, clearly, as Reg was suggesting, there's this arms race going on between those who would use this technology to spread misinformation and those, hopefully, on the journalism side of things who need to use it for trust and verification. I mean, we talk a lot about and study the technology around image creation and video creation and just how good and scary that's getting. And how do we as a news industry combat that? Is it, do we use blockchain? Do we use, what is it that we do? And I think there's so many facets of this. I mean, we're building a tool right now to help us speed up the process of verifying posts on social media. If we can use machine learning to help automate some of the processes that human journalists now go through to vet a piece of something that someone posted on Twitter, we can try to stop misinformation faster. You have those sorts of things going on, but that whole area, it's just getting more and more sophisticated, and which kind of gets back to the point about technological expertise and literacy in our own newsrooms. This is not a choice. We have to be able to, combat this with our own trusted content. But I suspect, it's been really interesting to see all of the different organizations working on creating matrices of trust using AI to score news articles. And, there's so much interesting work going on in attempting to figure out how we do this right. And I think that clearly is going to be a ripe area going forward.
Yeah, I want to add to this point that Lisa is talking about sophistication and bring an example from a different industry. The banking industry runs on trust. We leave them our money. So there was this study using longitudinal data sets of human behavior. So you see how powerful human behavior is for identification and then for trust-related issues. This was 3 months of data for 1.1 million bank users. Using only 3 transactions, they were able to identify who made the purchase in the 90% of the cases out of these 1.1 million users. And if they added the price of the transaction, they were able to increase the identification at 20%. So we're talking about how strong this human behavior traces that we leave, this metadata that we're leaving, is able to identify us. And I think out of content, that's even stronger. So this sophistication of methods that Lisa is talking about has already happened in other industries, and I think it's going to explode in...
And as a journalist, right, you sort of think about that and you think, what a great investigative tool if you needed to try and prove something was happening. A politician, you could identify that's the person that was receiving payments that he shouldn't have been receiving, albeit with GDPR issues and so on. And investigative journalists have always used these tools. The difference now is we can automate these tools and we can start using them on a daily basis, not on a monthly, weekly, 6-monthly basis. So that's a really exciting thing. And then, of course, the flip side of it is that governments and corporations are going to have all this ability to identify all sorts of things about you, and that's the scary side of things. Right. And sort of, being a journalist and sitting in that sort of that little tightrope between wanting enough power to be able to find things that hold power to account. And on the flip side of that, not wanting too much power to accrue to anybody, frankly, including journalists, because you have to worry about, what is out there and how much is known about anybody.
Yeah, and something that I wanted to push on a little bit, because I think all three of you have touched on, which is like this idea of news verification, the idea of rebuilding maybe some of the lost trust that some of the people out in the general populace have for the media. And I would love to know everybody's perspective on how we educate the general populace on the technology that's being used to verify the news, to avoid implicit bias. Like, Lisa, you mentioned, like, do we use blockchain to verify imagery or videos or whatever? I think the people on this stage, I think largely the people in this room go, oh, okay, cool. I can have some conceptual idea of what that is. But I think back to when we were working at Microsoft on Windows 7, and we did these ads where we said, to the cloud with Windows 7, which made total sense to us. And then my mother-in-law called me and said, so is the cloud like a thing that I have to buy? Do I have to install it? And it was very easy for me to kind of dismiss it and kind of blow it off. But from her perspective, like, this was magic. And I want to look at things like, when I look at AI, when I look at blockchain, we have to educate people on what that stuff actually means and how to use it and how to build trust in the technology. And I'm curious what your perspective is, not just from using it in the newsroom, but also educating the populace at large of, like, this is a technology that you can trust, or you can effectively, you can trust the watchmen who are watching the rest of society.
I mean, I'm smiling because I think that there's so little that the public understands about what journalists do. Forget about the technology, I mean, that just, but I mean, we have these ongoing discussions. I mean, right now when we produce stories using automation, we have an editor's note at the bottom that says, AP created this story using, automated insight software, et cetera, et cetera. And we're talking about that, like, one day, like, the day will come where that will seem silly. Like, it's new now, and so we feel like there's this need to disclose the use of these technologies, but it would be like 20 years ago we had to disclose that a digital camera was used, and
the story was reported using a telephone.
So but I do, like, it does get to these overall issues around, like, the ethics of technology.
Yeah.
And how much do we disclose? If we disclose, do people even understand what we're saying? And I don't know. I think that I don't have an answer. I think this is an evolving area, and at the end of the day, I think human journalists are going to have to do just a whole lot of explaining about what we're doing.
It's partly just getting, it's building standards, right? So, for example, in photography, there's a certain amount of, in the days before Photoshop, there was a certain amount of dodging, and I can't remember what all the techniques are that you could do. And with Photoshop, there's a certain amount that's permissible, at least within journalistic circles, and there's a certain amount that's not, right? So it's clearly Photoshopped images are not allowed. You talked about a tool for verifying social media, which we have too. And what it does is it comes out and it gives you a credibility score on it, right? And so we don't publish that out directly, but a score between 83% and 95%. I mean, what does that mean? And the analogy I think of is, we do polling, you do polling, and we say margin of error. Now, I'm guessing if you go ask the average reader, in fact, if you ask the average journalist, what does that mean? Most people will don't understand the statistical underpinnings of that, but they know it means there's that much that it could be on either side of things. And so I think we're going to get to a point where we'll have probabilistic truth, where it's highly likely that this transaction was carried out by that person, and there's a 95% certainty that it happened. And people at some point are going to get used to that. But I don't know how we get from here to there. And a lot of it, I think, is just establishing that there are standards that we follow and that we feel comfortable with.
Yeah. Mark.
Yeah, that sounds for me like the weather, no? It's 90% probability it's going to rain.
But that's always wrong.
Not in Seattle.
Yeah, exactly. In Seattle, especially right now, it's always rain. It's always rain. Mar, the ethical ramifications of AI and how things are built, I think, is a really interesting thing. Reg, you touched on, which is like, what is the ethical stake in the ground that we want to put to say, this is how we are choosing to build this technology, to make sure that it is as bias-free as possible, make sure that its predictions are as accurate as possible. And from a perspective, I'd
from
love
the
your
industry perspective, I think it's very clear when we create technology, we deliver it to the users and we see how they use it. And I think that's the normal way to do it, and it would be arrogant from our side to try to impose a certain way to use it. I think it's very similar. We're facing again this moment. It only happens every 20 years, I guess. When we first launched PC, people were asking all the time, what are we going to use this for? And over 20 years, we've seen some people use it for Excel spreadsheets and some people play games. And both things are, I think, very decent. And I think with AI, it's going to happen a very similar thing. And different industries are going to use it in different ways. And I'm really looking forward to learn and see how people use it so we make it better.
Excellent.
You know, Ben, I think what Reg said about, he used the word predictive, and I think that leads into, we should talk a little bit about these tools and data analysis and how we're using that for insights, because I do think that there's using the technology to help us do a better job reporting, yet being careful about predicting with certainty that this means something's going to happen. I mean, there are those lines, but I know we've talked about that a lot in some of our projects around social listening. And one of the things you've talked about is this idea that the technology is allowing us to achieve some of these insights better than we have before, but there is that danger of falling a little too in love with
Exactly.
that data.
And so, I mean, I think there was a very big step taken, I forget what it was, 15 years ago. Paul Steiger in the audience knows this because he won a Pulitzer Prize for it, which was the Wall Street Journal did a story about backdated options. And one of the critical lines in that story was there's a 300 million to 1, I could be mistaking the number, 300 million to 1 chance that this happened by accident. And it was one of the first examples of a groundbreaking story that essentially said, we don't know if this is true, but it's very, very likely that it's true. And so I think we are going to come up a bit to that stage. But I agree with you. It's a dangerous place to go. And that's why I think that as we build out these tools, certainly we're not unleashing them in the wild. What we're doing is we're making sure that those insights go to journalists and there's still a human level of understanding. Because at the end of the day, what are machines good at? Machines are good at sifting through tons of data in an automated fashion and sort of flagging outliers to you, interesting trends, milestones. And journalists are good at figuring out, causality, context, and sort of pulling that together. And so the machine can offer you 15 things, and you can say, knew that, knew that, knew that. Ooh, that's interesting. And then sort of, pull that into a story. So I think the need for this sort of cybernetic connection between humans and machines is going to be there for quite a long time. And that's the way I think to have people have confidence that the things that we're presenting them are, have been vetted by an actual human being.
Yeah, it's we look at it from an angle of augmenting human creativity with a massive computational power. I mean, the Wikipedia example is a great example of that, or sifting through every SEC filing or every patent application and be able to at least make some level of correlation, but not necessarily a causality, that then, taking the things that are the mundane and the time-consuming and automating that so humans can focus their increasingly limited amounts of time on the things that actually matter and the things that we are uniquely good at. I think it's a great perspective. It's one that we're aligned with. I want to flip back to something that we touched on early on in the conversation, which is this idea of personalized news and creating new experiences with AI. We talked a little bit about the AI-generated podcast. There's some great examples out of Microsoft Research about an AI that'll draw what you tell it to, draw me a bird, and it'll actually sketch you a bird, roughly.
Yeah, I think this was a breakthrough because many times we think of natural language processing as a separate thing and computer vision as a separate thing. And in this case, we were able to merge both of them. And I can see how that creates as you were saying, is this image real or not? We're entering into this era of stochastic journalism, sort of like probabilities. And as you were saying, all this idea that you gather all this information, you generate a correlation of these two things. When one increases, the other increases, and then you think, oh, wow, well, then if this is happening, this is going to happen, and you make a prediction. The prediction is completely wrong because it's not necessarily causality that you're reading. And I think that's a big danger for journalists to drive causality out of correlations. And in the case of generating content, if we're able to generate content out of, for example, in this case, we were able to say, draw a bird on a branch, and you will see a bird that would appear in front of your eyes, and was a picture that was never taken. It was computer generated, and it's amazing. It really looks real. So I think in your case of having blockchain to deliver, has this image been modified? Is this image verifiable? It's going to be more difficult on your side.
With personalization, I mean, even to get back to just a very simple example, I mean, it's one thing to talk about using automation to create multiple versions of the same video, say, so that a video producer doesn't have to sit there and spend time creating the vertical version, the horizontal version, the 60-second version, the 90-second version. I think we can all understand the efficiencies and reasons for doing that. But now let's say we can produce a sports story that's written from the winner's side and the loser's side. Should we do that? You know, I mean, on one hand, it's giving people maybe more, content that's relevant to them, but does that also contribute to the bubble? I mean, I think, these are the kinds of questions that, the whole ability to personalize is going to raise, and we're going to have to kind of deal with those.
And I think a lot of that really has to do with sort of the meta questions. What is journalism? What is journalism for? What are we here to do? Why do we create what we create, and how do we best serve the public, right? And a lot of what journalism is a product of the industrial processes that we created. It's a printing press. It's it's a delivery mechanism. Words on dead trees. And I think we're in a time and place now where we can sort of start thinking, what is it that we are here to do? How can we help the public? And the flip side of that is, and then what is journalism? What do journalists do? Do we, if in a world, ooh, wow, interesting echo. In a world where, we are helping program machines that might write narratives or write large parts of our narratives, are we there to help create the conditions for those narratives to exist? Are we there to collect facts? How do we actually work? And if you think about how, say, a photographer's life has changed from 100 years ago to now, where they needed to look for film, get film canisters to planes to get them out in time, and now they look for bandwidth, and then they shoot VR or 360. The world of graphics producers has changed dramatically too. Now they all write code and build frameworks. Previously they drew things by hand. So how is the work of a text journalist going to evolve in a world where they have these many more tools, and what is the product that we should create if we want to fulfill our true mission, the broader mission?
Yeah, I think about when you talk about that, like the role of the human journalist and the creativity that you have. I think about this great story from that Steve Jobs told years ago, where he talked about the efficiency of animals to move 1 kilometer, and how the condor was the animal that required the least energy to travel a kilometer, and that humans were somewhere in the bottom third. But that we may not be the physically strongest, we may not have the most natural gifts, but the thing that we do have is that we're tool builders and we're innovators. And if you take that idea of the human innovation and humans as a tool builder, and you put that same human on a bicycle, it blows the condor out of the water. And it becomes the most efficient animal on Earth, because we've taken the human idea of the human potential and augmented it with technology. So I always look at that as kind of my beacon for like the potential of these kind of new technologies to take our natural human gifts and turn them into something magical. And we have about 6 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we kind of end on a high note. We've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about personalization, we've talked about trust, we've talked about security, we've talked about education, we've talked about efficiency, we've talked about some of the potential pitfalls in those things, but I want to end on a high note. When you think about the promise of AI, you think about the potential, what gives you the most hope when it comes to the idea of using AI in the journalism and the media industry? Marty, you want to start?
Sure. So for me, and I think in Microsoft, everybody's very focused on empowering everybody and every organization. And I think the AI we want to deliver is for every journalist to use, no matter big or small, to make their lives better, to, as you were saying, augment them, make them easier to build their things, to create their content. And also I think empowerment is going to bring them back all these original news business of advertising, personalizing the content, and it's going to come back from these aggregators that have been eating on this part, and it's going to go back to the news organizations. And I think we are going to empower every one of you to do that. So I'm very happy, and I think I'm positive about the future of journalism.
And listen, I can draw a direct line between automating earnings stories and the increase in investigative stories that our business news department was able to do. And when you hear about those kinds of examples, or the Swiss group Media built a tool to query 20 different police websites for press releases and bring that information into a central feed, and it pings the websites every 10 minutes looking for new news. So imagine, instead of having that reporter having to go out and look at 20 different websites all the time, all they have to do is look at one feed, and the robot is doing the work for them. These are very practical and current examples of how time is being saved in newsrooms from work that is not particularly high level. And so I am optimistic about how we can take these kinds of basic innovations and scale them to where we've got an augmented newsroom where journalists are really able to be journalists.
And I agree with both Maya and Lisa on all the things that we can do, and I also think that there's the potential to do so much more, right? The ability to actually do analysis on data that right now nobody really has the time to even ask the questions. And I think really broadly, journalism for all of its, for all the good it's done to the world, has also dramatically underserved communities all over the place, right? And we've seen some of those corrected now because journalism is much more democratized in many ways, as is misinformation, unfortunately. But what it means, I think, is that the ability to now serve lots of audiences that were not able to be served essentially by mass media, because we can go segment by segment by segment. I think that's a really great step forward and at least a great potential step forward. But since I'm a journalist, I also have to do the flip side of things, which is I think there is an arms race. I think that this all costs money. It takes resource and technology and intelligence, and that there are people who are going to misuse this as well. And I think that we all have to be vigilant, make sure we have the right standards, make sure we're thinking about all the ways that things can go wrong as well as the ways that things will go right.
Yeah, I think that's a very good perspective. And if I liken it to medicine, like the ounce of prevention counteracting a pound of cure, like the more that we can work together now to set those ethical standards, to build the systems, to educate the populace, like we are just scratching the surface of what AI and journalism can do, and establishing that great positive ethical baseline now, and using that to power the prototypes and the theoretical things that we want to work on to really pioneer this new age of journalism is going to be incredibly important rather than having to try and think about it retroactively after it's already out the door. We are just about out of time. We were hoping to take some questions, but due to Steve's unfortunate technical difficulties, we had to start about 5 minutes late. But I would ask if everybody from our panel will hang out off to the side. If you have questions, we'd love to talk to you. And if you want to explore a little bit more about the practical side of AI that can be applied in the journalism and the content creation that you're using right now, there's a workshop later this afternoon on data journalism and how you can tell better stories using Microsoft Power BI and some of the AI functionality in there. And then there's a master class tomorrow morning about everyday AI for modern media, and we'd love to see it both. And panelists, thank you for coming out. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Appreciate it. Bye.
Really good job.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll talk off. There's a lot of stuff going on.
Oh, no. Okay.
Careful.
Thank you to the last panel. Just one personal footnote on my own experience dealing with AI before we move on to the next speaker. Having transitioned from being a journalist to correspondent, running a company that uses neural networks to transcribe, I think one of the learnings that I can share with you is that AI is not always the end in itself. People say, well, isn't Trent going to disrupt? Aren't people going to lose jobs because they don't have to transcribe and they don't? And aren't you going to allow people to lay off? There are teams. The answer is no.